Welcome to Sports Wise, a podcast about sports and the law with your host, me, Gabe Feldman, director of the Tulane Sports Law Program and co-director of the Tulane Center for Sport. On this episode, I'm joined by the athletic director at the University of North Carolina, Bubba Cunningham, and Yahoo Sports senior college football reporter, Ross Dellenger, to talk about the latest in college sports, including transfer portal restrictions, eligibility lawsuits, NIL enforcement, athlete compensation, Olympic sport funding, employment status, Title IX, conference alignment, and whether schools can control costs, protect athletes, and create national rules that actually work. Here we go. Welcome to the podcast, Bubba Cunningham and Ross Dellenger. Thanks so much to both of you for coming on.
Sure.
Thank you, Gabe.
All right. We, as always, have a lot to talk about. It's rare to have two folks like you on the podcast at the same time. So I think this is maybe Ross' third or fourth or 12th time. Bubba, it's your inaugural trip on the podcast. And I want to talk about various issues that are going on in college sports that have been going on for a very long time that you and Ross have been talking about for decades. And I want to frame it in maybe a slightly different way as we try to move forward to solutions. And I've been thinking about this, and three things are maybe fall into three buckets. One, where there's general agreement about the problem in college sports, and there's also general agreement about how to solve the problem. And then number two is there's general agreement that there is a problem, but there's disagreement about how to solve it. And then the third one, which may be the most challenging, is where people can't even disagree whether there's a problem or not. And in that first category, you would think there'd be the highest chance for success in terms of reaching change in the short term. And in the last one, you would think it would maybe be the lowest chance. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on where you think each of these areas I'm about to walk through fit into those three buckets. And if you do think there's chance for agreement, what that agreement might look like. So, Bubba, I want to start with you. And let's go with transfer portal restrictions. And I don't know that there's been a hotter topic in sports other than maybe eligibility and NIL and gambling and the 4,000 other issues that are out there. But certainly one of the hottest issues is the transfer situation now, where as opposed to the past where you had a free year, one year transfer, you had to then sit out a year. Now there's basically unlimited transfers without any sitting out, without any real restriction. So, Bubba, is there general agreement that this is a problem? And if so, is there general agreement about how to solve it?
Yeah, I think you're right, Gabe. And first of all, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. And I appreciate being on with Ross because I have a ton of respect for what Ross has been able to cover. And I think he has been talking about a lot of these issues, as you have as well, Gabe. But I do think the transfer portal is one, there's general agreement. There's too much movement. This past year, almost 50% of the Division I basketball players entered the portal. That just doesn't seem to be something that is good for the academy. That many kids transferring generally to either play more or to receive more money. It's not educationally based. So I do think that the rules that were in place that limited the transfer were there because of an educationally foundational principle, which was the longer you stay at one school, the more likely you are to graduate. And then over time, the freedom of movement usurped that value. And so now freedom of movement is where we are. And I do think there's general consensus. We should probably dial that back in some way.
Okay, great. Ross, where do you fall on this?
Yeah, I appreciate being on too, especially with a respected like Bubba, who knows a lot of these issues and certainly has probably a different approach, at least publicly, saying publicly what maybe some others are thinking privately. So always appreciate that. This issue.
Do you appreciate being on with me? Or just Bubba?
Yeah, of course, Gabe. Of
All right.
course.
All right.
The
Sometimes things
venerable
should be
Gabe.
said.
Yeah, no, of course. In fact, we should talk because I'm going to need your help in July at some event in DC. So there you go. You
Okay.
roped me into this, so I'm going to rope
right.
you into something
Fair enough.
in DC. But this issue for fans seems to be mostly, at least for fans, is something they can agree on, that they want to recognize more like they used to their players on a year-to-year basis. Bubba mentioned the academic component of this, obviously, which is important because these two things, major college sports and higher education, are tethered together. But for the fans, and what I hear from them is, I don't know who's on my team from year to year, and I can't follow it like I used to. Now, maybe that's something that fans are just going to have to get used to. This is the new way. But I think most people would say if there's some kind of way, method that we can just reduce the movement a little bit, that it might be better for the industry as a whole. It's how to do that that there's real disagreement in.
And is the disagreement about how to do it in a way that can survive lawsuits, or is it disagreement on what the actual solution should be? Because those are two different things. You could say everybody agrees that we should be able to restrict them if they do two or more transfers, but then there's a different issue about whether that will be attacked successfully in court. But is there general agreement that a one free year, a one free transfer is the answer? Or are there some who say, no, it should be two, three, four, or it should just be situation specific, that if a coach leaves, or like the old days, if there was a hardship or something, that there should be more flexibility?
Yeah, I think that you're right. I think there's general agreement, there's too much transferring, but I do think people could compromise and get to a spot where you can have some legislation that would make sense, as long as there were some exceptions. And that's, I know that gets us into trouble when we do that. What we're seeing on the 5 for 5, at least publicly, is there would be exceptions for military service, religious things, pregnancies, and some other very significant reasons why you'd have the exception. But I do believe that one free transfer makes sense, and then maybe sit a year after that. I understand, but you probably would need some type of antitrust protection for that to stand up in court. So I think we're going to need both some thoughtful legislation that would work through Congress, and some thoughtful guidelines that the NCAA or some entity could enforce.
Yeah, the path to reducing or implementing the one-time transfer, or re-implementing it, or in some other way reducing movement, I think could be done now in a way by the schools through rev share contracts. And we've seen some of that, but I don't know that's the long-term answer, because some of these contracts, we don't know, I guess, yet if some of these contracts are truly like binding and how enforceable they are, because the athletes aren't employees. That's an issue. I think to limit athletes or restrict them in any way is going to come with legal issues, like we've seen. If you don't have a congressional bill, or if you don't have employment in collective bargaining with it, right? There's going to be some kind of legal challenges no matter what you do if you are restricting athletes in any way. So the pathways there are for Congress to implement maybe some kind of limited antitrust exemption that could be even temporary, maybe, which is being discussed, maybe just to see how college athletics in the powers that be handle these exemptions. Or if you don't get anything from Congress, you could lean on, the executive order, the NCAA could, and reestablish the one-time transfer. The problem with that, of course, is the case out of West Virginia and a bunch of other states who sued the NCAA over the transfer policy, and the Department of Justice jumped in, and the NCAA kind of settled the case and agreed that there would be a free transfer. So this one is incredibly complicated, and I just don't see any other way around it unless you get congressional involvement or you get collective bargaining.
Yeah, and just two things to add on to that. Then we can move to the next topic. But one is that, just for our purposes of discussion, I think for all of these that we're going to talk about, there could be legal challenges if you try to implement the solution. And what I want to think about is just if there's a solution that people generally agree on, and then they might not be able to achieve that solution without collective bargaining or without federal legislation. So to put that one aside, because I think for most of these, we can say they probably
Yeah.
can't do this unless they get protection from legal attack, whether that comes from Congress, the president, or a collective bargaining agreement. And then the second one is, I would say, and I don't think the NCAA necessarily wants to do this strategy, but there may be, now that we've seen what's gone on without our transfer rules or restrictions, that you might have a better chance of defending the rules now that courts get to see what might happen and how many athletes are going into the portal and what impact, to the extent we know, this is having on graduation rates or academic opportunities. So there is still that path of convincing judges. I know that path has been met with mixed success. I think sometimes people overstate the losses the NCAA has had in court and what those losses mean. But I also understand not wanting to run an organization through litigation and having to hope that a judge rules your way so that you can keep your rules enforced. But then the third point is one of the obstacles to transfers in the past has been that it's not always easy to get academic credits to transfer from one institution to another. And I know I've worked with a lot of schools where they've had difficulty because either the student was transferring over with credits from a major that doesn't exist at this particular school or offered by professors or in a format that doesn't transfer over academic credits. And that made it difficult for the athlete to be academically eligible. Are those restrictions, are those rules still being enforced? Are they being ignored? Have they changed? Because it seems like even if you had allowed all these transfers 15, 20 years ago, a lot of athletes would not have been eligible because they wouldn't have had sufficient academic credits. So what's changed on that?
Yeah, I think they are. We still have progress toward degree. And I think that what you do see are some students that want to transfer and can't get to their next destination because they don't have progress toward a degree, because that school won't accept a number of credits. If you transfer as a freshman or a sophomore, you're typically in pretty good shape. Once you get to your junior year, it gets much more difficult. And then obviously the third time you can transfer is when you graduate. So if
Right.
you go and have a couple of years at another place and graduate, so you really have three really good opportunities to transfer. And so I do think it's still being enforced. But the initial question to ask was, what do we agree on? I think there's a couple of things that most people would agree on. And we're talking about the transfer portal. The other one I think that most people would agree is there should be some type of I don't say an age limit, but I do think that college athletes typically are between a minimum of 17 years old. And once you start pushing 25, that's an 8-year window. And most people think that's way too many anyways, but there's other reasons why you go that high. And I think the third piece is we should be somehow connected to education. And I think people generally believe those three principles. To get that in today's environment, since the NCAA is in violation of antitrust, I think, as Ross mentioned, I think we're going to need some type of antitrust protection, even to get those two things. Limit the transfers, limit the age limit in which you can participate. But the fundamental challenge, I think, with the antitrust thing is, do we believe we have a national governing body that has credibility that they'll grant that to, even if it's time limited? And I think that's a real question that is probably holding up the debate. So those are just a couple of thoughts on where we are. And then we get to employment compensation and
Right.
additional sports broadcasting opportunities. I think those are much further down the road.
So let's go with the NCAA and the national organization and the trust or lack of trust or faith in that organization being able to implement these rules. Do you think, Bubba, it sounds like you're suggesting that might be an obstacle. Is it an obstacle because of just the recent past or the longer past, or is it fear that that they don't have the authority that they used to have, or that it maybe should be a more decentralized system where conferences should have more authority? What's the concern? And then again, how is that manifesting itself in potentially slowing down federal legislation?
I think it's everything you mentioned. I don't think there's any one thing that says, hey, this is the reason. The NCAA is 100 years old. And I thought for a lot of years, decisions were made what people thought were in the best interest of students. But when you're told twice you're in violation of antitrust, and then Kavanaugh comes in over the top and says there's not a lot of public good to what you're doing, we're going to be more punitive. The last 5 years have accelerated that. And so the eligibility is determined by the NCAA. The enforcement, now we have two enforcement agencies. We've got the NCAA enforcement, we have CSC. So we've already fractured kind of the governance structure, at least the enforcement piece of it. So I think that demonstrated there's a lack of confidence in our ability to govern ourselves. And so I think that's part of the problem.
Ross, you're nodding your head. I know you've been on Capitol Hill many, probably more times than you ever wish you had been. But is
Mm.
that part of the sense that you're getting? Because that was 6, 7, 8 years ago when the NCAA was asking for a blanket antitrust exemption. The answer was always, why would we give you blanket ability to otherwise violate the law if we one don't have confidence in your ability to govern college sports, and two, haven't shown us a specific plan that will sufficiently protect athletes and provide broad-based opportunities and everything else we're looking for. So is that are we past that, or are we still, is that still an obstacle where maybe the only entity less popular in this country than Congress is the NCAA? Is that still true?
Yeah, I had someone on the Hill tell me a long time ago, the only thing that Republicans and Democrats can agree on is the hate for the NCAA.
Yeah.
And I think that the issues we're seeing with the SCORE Act, which has been delayed again, is the hate for the NCAA and granting protections to the NCAA for over a variety of matters is an issue for many people. And I think that's why the latest legislation we've seen from the SCORE Act and from conversations in the Senate too has been to not eliminate the NCAA, but to establish some kind of different governance oversight over college sports that would monitor and oversee what the NCAA is doing potentially, or what conferences are doing. So that's the latest thing that we're seeing when it comes to that. But it still lingers for sure here. I don't know that it's getting any better. I will say that the change from Mark Emmert to Charlie Baker has improved things. I think Charlie Baker can get into and has gotten into more offices and seeing more people who have embraced him a little more than what they would Mark Emmert, or what they did. So I think that's a positive, but there's still this like mistrust. I think deep mistrust from lawmakers on granting all these protections to an association that they believe has through the years abused those different rules and regulations. And on the demo, and that's even many Republicans on the Democrat side. Certainly there is a real hesitancy, right, to grant any kind of protections without some kind of assurances that there'll be more oversight above the NCAA.
And when you mentioned the hate, and I mentioned the hate also, who is the, like, on the bulletin board with or the dart board, or people are throwing darts at when they say NCAA? Because it's not, people don't hate Charlie. I think most people really like Charlie Baker. People don't hate, nobody hates Bubba. Nobody, I've never met anybody who hates Bubba. So who is the hate focused on? Who do they think the NCAA, like when they think it's the NCAA's fault, who are they thinking of? Are they thinking of university presidents? Are they thinking ADs? Are they thinking the staff?
Hmm.
Who's the target of it?
First of all, I think they're thinking the logo. Remind,
Yeah.
I'm serious, right? The
Yep.
shield of the NCAA is something that just branded in everybody's mind as this overarching sort of thing in Indianapolis that governs college athletics, when we all really know that the schools and the conferences make the rules, right? The NCAA is just there to enforce the rules that they make. But I think that's a good question of identifying the actual people. And I would say, for the most part, that conference commissioners, especially their role in all of this, has grown. Their authority are probably at the top of that list, along with probably noteworthy and big time athletic directors and head football coaches,
Right.
probably too. And what always comes up is the money that head football coaches and athletic directors, and to a degree conference commissioners, make, right? Because that's really, it boils down to all the issues that college athletics is happening when it comes to athlete compensation got started because of coach compensation first. And I think that's something that still really lingers. And we saw last week a school give $2 million more to its head football coach who just completed his second season. And I get it. It's a competitive market. I understand the pressure that's on athletic directors and coaches to win and to compete in a recruiting environment with agents. But the money is not helping the cause on the
Right.
Hill for sure. I can give a
Yeah.
really quick example, Gabe, and I've written about this. The SCORE Act was going to the floor December 1st to be voted on and seemed to have the votes. And then 4 days before it was supposed to hit the floor, Lane Kiffin was hired at LSU and got a $13 million contract. And don't think that that didn't have an impact on why that didn't get to the floor. I think it did.
Right. And that was after they had just fired Brian Kelly and paid him a
$75
big
million dollars or whatnot. Yeah.
for a buyout. And then in Lane Kiffin's new contract, there's not only a massive buyout, but there's also no offset. So if
Yeah.
anything, the contract was worse from that perspective than the prior one. And yeah, it certainly raised a lot of alarm bells here in the state of Louisiana, but I know nationally as well. But going back for a second, and I want to come back to the compensation question in a minute, but going back to the coaching issues, because one of the, I think, challenges is not only the coaching salaries, but the coaching movement and the coaching carousel and the general perception, if not reality, that a coaching contract isn't really worth very much in terms of keeping the coach there, because if a coach wants to move after they've signed a multi-year extension, the coach is going to move because another school is going to be willing to pay their buyout. And there are some exceptions where that doesn't happen, but for the most part, we see like Lane Kiffin, but it goes all the way up and down. It's not just the top coaches at the top level. And the coaches are getting a lot of money. The coaches are moving whenever they want. And then the athletes aren't getting a lot of money. This is prior to NIL era, and they're not able to move. And I think part of it was a little discomfort with that disparity, that why are we putting all the restrictions on the athletes but none on the coaches? And we'll get into the compensation issue in a second, but on the movement issue, I think that does give people a little bit of pause on the transfer portal, that why are we preventing the athletes from moving but these coaches can keep moving, and particularly if a coach has recruited an athlete. But in terms of the athlete eligibility issues and the 5 for 5 that Charlie Baker announced that might become the new rule, that you get 5 years to play 5 seasons instead of the 4 and 5 with all the different exceptions, that's led to all these different lawsuits. So from your perspectives, is the 5 and 5, is that, again, because I think most people would identify a player staying 12 years and playing 11 seasons would be a problem, but is the solution, is 5 and 5 generally agreed on as a solution? Again, with potential exceptions, as Bub, as you mentioned, for religious, military, health reasons. And Bubba, as you also said, the more waivers you give, the more difficult it becomes, because then somebody else says, why'd they get a 6th year? I should get a 6th year. So the harder the line is, the brighter the line is, the easier it is. But also then you get these cases where somebody says, I was in the military for 3 years and then my mother passed away, and you're now saying I can't play in college sports because I'm 22. But in general, is the 5 and 5 where people feel comfortable with, or plus or minus? Is there sort of consensus around that?
I think so, because I do think that kind of fits. It somewhat aligns with the graduation rates and the time that most students are in a school. It somewhat aligns with the age limit that seems to be appropriate for college athletes. Again, I think that the antitrust exemption is going to be critical to that because you'll get inconsistencies in the waivers, and I think you need a national standard for it. And so back into what Ross was asking earlier, do you think the NCAA would be better served by just taking the enforcement agency part out of the NCAA and give it all to the CSC? You've got a court appointed or a court mandated enforcement agency for a piece of our standards, but not all of it. Would that help? To me, you did mention to Gabe, what's wrong with the federal government? What's bad about the federal government? You point to the IRS and say, okay, that they're out there to get me. Now, I feel the same way about the NCAA enforcement. The NCAA does a lot of good things, but the enforcement piece is what really people have a hang up over. So could they take that out and restore some credibility?
I mean, that's an interesting point. And so it's maybe part of the hatred the NCAA gets is because they are the ones coming in and handing down the penalties, and people are complaining that they're doing it in a inconsistent or selective way. And so everybody hates them because they've ruled against one of their schools or one of their athletes. And if you have somebody else be the bad guy and they just do the good stuff, they're running championships, maybe that remove some of the target. But then it just seems maybe it shifts the target. The new NCAA becomes the CSC, and then everybody hates the CSC, and the CSC then gets sued because actually one of the next questions I was going to ask is about CSC's attempts to regulate the house settlement, and we have our 20.5 million about to grow cap on the direct payments from the schools, the rev share payments, and then the NIL deals that have to be subject to that CSC review and the NIL Go platform and make sure it's for fair market value and for a valid business purpose. And we have our first major, it appears to be, arbitration case scheduled for tomorrow, I believe, where 18 Nebraska athletes are, as they have a right, Bob, as you mentioned, under the settlement, to seek arbitration because their deals were rejected. And as I understand it, the deals were rejected because the Nebraska's MMR partner was warehousing their rights, paying the athletes a bunch of money for their NIL, but without any specific purpose for it yet. The idea being that they'll be able to do deals with those rights, and this gives them the freedom, like a Learfield would, to go out and sell sponsorship and media rights for the school. This just gives them the ability to do this on their own now that they have all the rights. And CSC claiming that violates the rules of the House settlement and CSC. And I think the assumption is, Ross, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that if Nebraska loses the arbitration, if the athletes lose the arbitration, then we're likely to see the Nebraska Attorney General bring a challenge that rejection violates Nebraska's state law that says you can't interfere with athlete NIL rights. And so even if it's not a federal court coming in to say it, you might have a state law on the books that says you can't do this, or you might have a state law that puts it on the books that says no outside entity can determine whether an athlete's NIL compensation is fair. And I think if Nebraska wins this case, we'll see every state do something similar. So it's a long way, it's a long wind up to coming back to the point here. A broader point, is there general agreement that the spending issue on athletes is a problem? That this House settlement was designed to create a new framework that would give athletes up to $20.5 million. Doesn't matter what it's for, doesn't matter who it goes to, at least not yet. And then they can also do their own NIL deals like any other student on campus. Is there general agreement that system is not working particularly well and needs a solution? And if so, what is the solution?
Yeah, Bubba will probably speak to this better than I can, but I think many people within college athletic administration, whether it's university presidents or athletic directors, would believe that the House settlement is not working as they thought it would. I think when the House settlement was introduced to administrators close to 2-ish years ago, that this was coming down the pipe. And then when it was pitched to them, it was pitched to them as a way to, number one, trigger congressional action, because you are paying the athletes back pay and forward pay. It's a good faith effort to compensate athletes. And I think many thought that would turn into congressional legislation. So that's number one. Number two, that even without congressional legislation, that it would provide some sort of stability in college athletics from a compensation standpoint and from a movement standpoint, that it would do more to stabilize things, especially with the advent of the CSC and the enforcement model to prevent overspending. Neither one of those things have happened. No congressional bill, and certainly there's been no stability. In fact, the House settlement, for lack of a better phrase, has cost schools an additional $20 million to what they were already paying in collective and NIL, and that the amounts has only gone higher, right? We've seen every year it go higher. So I talked to many university presidents who have told me to my face directly, I regret voting for the House settlement.
Yeah. I think the question, Gabe, you asked a really good question.
Finally, I asked a good one.
No, because it depends on who you ask.
Right.
ADs, donors, commissioners, presidents. Yeah, this has been a real challenge for us. Students, agents, families, been a windfall. Been terrific for them. So there's people that think, hey, this is the market. The market for this is different. And we tried to compare it. We thought it was compared to maybe a pro market. I think I read somewhere 13% of the NFL players have commercial deals. And then 80% of the college guys do. And it's a different market. And I think it even helps a little bit to go backwards and say that the 20 million was predicated on 22% of the commercial activity related to what we were doing in college sports. And if you add that to the educational benefits that we give, it's about 50%, which approximated what the pro leagues are doing. And we're totally blown by that. And what is the right market? We don't, and again, I hear a lot of people, we don't regulate coaches' pay. We don't regulate the coaches' movement. So why are we trying to regulate the participants' movement? Part of it is those are professional opportunities that are contracted and they are employees. And now we have students that are just developing their skills and they receive educational benefits. So we're in a tough spot. And I don't think we're going to resolve anything anytime soon, because I do think this compensation issue is one that's going to take a couple of more years to really start to figure out a way for us to resolve it to make sense for everybody.
And so let me ask two related questions. One, and Ross, this is probably better for you, but how many schools do you think are genuinely paying up to the 20.5 and then their athletes are doing what we would call legitimate NIL deals, and those are getting approved by CSC, and that's it? And so you've got the system that we wanted, and the system that theoretically we have in pro sports, where the NFL owners pay up to their cap, whatever exceptions they can get over the cap, and then their players, as Bubba said, a relatively small, very small percentage of them might have NIL deals, some of them national deals, most of them small local deals, and that's it. And if the players try to circumvent that, then there will be severe repercussions. We're seeing some of that maybe play out in the NBA with Kawhi Leonard and the LA Clippers. So how many schools are actually abiding by that versus either continuing to pay or paying under the table or trying to come up with creative ways to pay their athletes to essentially go above the cap and couch it as an NIL deal?
None.
Yeah.
I don't know that any power conference school is, let me rephrase it. I think every power conference school to a degree is manufacturing NIL deals, right? To stay with the market, the competitive market. When I say manufactured NIL deals, it's a phrase used. I take that from Brian Seeley, the CSC CEO, who calls NIL deals that where schools are facilitating through third parties and moving money around, redirecting money from multimedia rights partners, corporate sponsors, apparel brands. Those are manufactured deals. The athletes aren't getting them in an authentic way as a pro athlete would. They're being manufactured by the school. So I think everybody's, to a degree, is doing that.
Yeah. It does remind me, though, in a way, of the difference when you go to a restaurant and the menu, it says handmade pie. I don't know that I'll know the difference if it's someone's using their hand or someone using a machine to make that pie. So sometimes that manufactured versus organic. But anyway, that's a tangent. But
yeah. But I think just some are doing it to a degree that pushes, to put a number on it, like football rosters over 30, $40 million. Some are doing it and maybe can't do it to that amount because they don't have the donor base or the corporate sponsor money to either backfill any redirect or to just do the redirect itself. They just don't have the resources to do it. I was asked recently about like how many power conference schools are spending at least $40 million on their football roster. And from talking to agents who represent coaches and players and administrators who are involved, I think that the number is probably at least a dozen or at $40 million or more, which is pretty wild considering that the cap is 20. in is pretty
20
wild
for all
considering
athletes.
for all athletes, right? Not
Yeah.
just football. Yeah.
Right. 15 for according
For
to the
football,
percentages.
yeah,
Yeah.
14 to 16 is usually the range
Yeah.
of rev share from the
Right.
school. And so you're talking about going 25 to 35 million over that amount is where we're seeing a lot of power conference football programs, which is why it circles back to the arbitration case with Nebraska. I think there's a lot of schools that will be in arbitration depending on how this arbitration case goes because their manufactured deals are getting rejected. And we haven't
Right.
even gotten to the basketball deals from the basketball portal, which most schools are at 3, 4, 5 million in rev share for men's basketball. And most rosters are over 10 million. I think the top 40 or 50 programs are over 10 million. So if you do all these numbers, put all these numbers together, you're talking about getting through NIL Go 30 to 40 million dollars combined for men's basketball and football per school at the highest level, like the top 20 or 30 or 40. And that's just inconceivable. You
Right.
just can't. And so I think we're going to see issues, and Nebraska just happens to be the first.
Right. Bubba, go ahead. You look like you were going to jump in.
I think that's why the plaintiffs' attorneys have filed the case about the MMR deals. And if the school's willing to give their entire MMR package and their apparel package to their student athletes, then all of a sudden you've gotten there. And that's why they're pushing it. And that's why they don't want to go to arbitration.
Right.
Because I think we've all understood that wasn't the intent. The intent was what we had described before.
And it's interesting because I think we all know Jeffrey Kessler, one of the lead plaintiffs' lawyers, who has been the architect of most of the lawsuits involving professional athlete players associations, and they have dissolved their union, brought an antitrust suit, and then reached an antitrust settlement that sets up a system like is set up here in the House case, but then gets captured inside of a collective bargaining agreement without the ability to have collective bargaining here. The effort was to have the same system where you have a cap and then the athletes can do their NIL deals, but there's strict enforcement. But instead of it being collectively bargained, have it be judicially sanctioned and then hope that the schools would buy into that. And as we're seeing, that hasn't worked. So in terms of solutions, just to get through this quickly, and then we'll cover on the last couple of quick topics. Again, the federal legislation, an antitrust exemption, collective bargaining would be methods to do this, would be a process to get there. But in terms of the outcome, the result, one outcome could be you just increase the cap significantly. And that way there's less cheating. At least it's more transparent that rather than pay $40 million and 20 of it's through rev share and then 20 of it's through these manufactured deals, just do 40 of it directly from the school and then go to the pro model and have really strict enforcement on your NIL deals and give a little more teeth to CSC. Or you just blow up the cap and just say you just spend whatever you want. And because it seems like the other solution, which is the House settlement, is not sustainable because schools, at least in the short term, aren't really following it. And again, we'll see what comes out of the CSC. And even if the CSC and the arbitration does rule in favor of the CSC, it's probably going to lead to litigation. So yes, you can maybe win those lawsuits, but if you don't, and you need to come up with a new system, are either of those systems the increasing the cap or eliminating the cap? Is there any sense that that would be palatable for the schools or for the conferences? And I know it's different. The SEC might have a different answer than the Mountain West. But what's your sense? And if those aren't the solutions, what are the possible solutions short of antitrust exemption, CBA?
Yeah, I haven't considered raising the cap. I've always heard no cap, soft cap, hard cap. Raising the cap's an interesting concept. What I have been most interested in, because I do think regulation is going to be a challenge for us, but requiring disclosure, I think, would really be helpful. And maybe raising the cap, because raising the cap, the rev share is disclosed because we're paying it and we have to do that. So maybe that would be one way to try to curb it, but everyone says, well, you're just going to go beyond it anyways. But
Right.
maybe it is a step in the right direction. That's an interesting concept. I know that university CFOs and college presidents have a stroke to even consider something like that because we're
Well, but then at least it does what the House settlement was in part designed to do is move it into the sunlight and regulate it and say, rather than having that 20 million that was being spent by the boosters and the collectives, have it come directly from the schools. And it's the same money in some ways. It's just that money was being shifted over to the boosters. Now it's shifting back to the schools. So now the MMR partners can just raise the money and give it to the schools, who can give it to the athletes instead of them giving it directly to the athletes. And then at least we have some oversight over it. And so it's the same, again, it's generally the same money. It's just coming from a different spot. The direct transaction is a little bit different.
And it's the same as we do with our coaches. We're taking a lot
Right.
of that money that we used to get. The coaches had their coaches show, they had their camps, they had their
Right.
Nike
Right.
deals, they had all that. We bundled it all up and now we give it all to the coaches. It's the
Right.
same principle 30 years later.
And now we don't have to have the coach do their show with 9 people at the sports bar and say they're getting $250,000 for it. So
That's right.
but
It's an interesting point, Gabe, about raising the cap. And I think it's been talked about, like the question right now, I think that commissioners in the NCAA and others are starting to ask and talk seriously about is what to do about the cap. And I think depending on how the Nebraska case goes and how the Kessler motion goes at the end of May, could basically just implode the whole thing. And so you need to answer that question of, okay, what can we do about the cap? And I think there are a few things being bantered about. And one of them includes, raising the cap and any funds that a school distributes to athletes above the cap is taxed as a luxury tax, like they do in baseball. And I think that's something that's being talked about. Kessler and Berman, the plaintiff attorneys in the House case, would probably love for the cap to be raised. It means more money for athletes and it means more money potentially in their pocket as well. So I don't think that would be a problem. It would be a problem with many in the ACC and Big 12,
right.
and probably even some in the SEC and Big 10. I mean, it might not be a problem for the top 15 programs. For everybody else, there could be a problem there. And that's why you have this compromise of maybe can you implement a luxury tax, some kind of penalty if you go over the new cap, or even you keep the current cap there, right? And any money you spend over gets taxed, and you just don't worry about the incredible waste of time going on right now. I'm sure Bubba can speak to this, of administrators trying to redirect all these funds from multimedia rights and sponsors, redirect all this stuff, break down all these deals into smaller deals to get them through, submit these deals, answer questions from the CSC about the deal. It's a mess and a waste of time and resources. It's been pretty obvious. And so how can you avoid that? Just depending on what happens with this motion and the arbitration stuff, let's just get past that and allow the school to spend directly the money, as you were talking about, Gabe, but maybe put some kind of tax on it. The problem with that is, and I'll say this is the last thing, is that will the schools abide by the tax? Will they follow the rules, basically?
And I get it, certainly why the ACC and the Big 12 and the American might be opposed to raising the cap or eliminating the cap. But if the reality is that the top of the Big 10 and the SEC are going over the cap through these other deals, what's the difference? It's already happening. The spending disparity is already there. It's just they're going through all these hoops and hiding it and then having to arbitrate. And so if they're already outspending you, why not just put it out in the open and then put some real limits on it? Or at least try to, and then maybe they'll cheat anyway. And then the other point is that it's funny because if you talk to people in baseball, Major League Baseball, they would say their system is horrible, and they may end up in a lockout next year because they're going to try to put in a salary cap because the luxury tax is not working. And for those of you who are Dodgers fans or not Dodgers fans, understand why Major League Baseball system doesn't necessarily work. And for those of you who like me who are Mets fans, just don't understand why the Mets system doesn't work because the thought is more money you spend, the more you win, except I guess if you're the Mets. But last couple of quick issues, because I've already taken up too much of your time. Do you think there is any appetite to limit coach compensation as part of an overall package to limit spending in college sports?
Never seen it happen. Never seen caps on compensation until it's collectively bargained.
Yeah.
I just don't see it happening. But to your point about caps, I want to go back to that just for a second. Again, it's an imperfect system. We all recognize that. But the violation of antitrust is all about the caps that were put in place. And over a 30-year period, the caps that were put in place, the number of coaches, the number of games, the number of scholarships, the years of eligibility, all those caps were put in place to create some type of equal competition or equitable competition among hundreds of schools. All the conversation in the last 5 years is driving us to spending a lot of money on a very few number of students playing a very few number of sports. And so it is an entirely different model. And so I think is what we're trying to wrestle with is how does broad-based programming across multiple states, multiple leagues, now we're in conflict with this pro model of let's pay the best players in the most popular sport the most money. And we're trying to resolve that. And quite frankly, I think we're to the point of where we were in 07 and 08 with the economic crisis in the too big to fail. We are over leveraged. We're spending too much money. We're borrowing too much money. We're taking too much risk. And we're looking for someone to bail us out, whether it's the federal government or the courts or somebody else. And at some point, we'll have that Lehman moment where the crisis will hit, something will fail, and that will trigger the change that we've all been trying to push, unless we try to take control of it ourselves. I would love for us to do that, but I'm fearful that we're not going to get enough consensus on all the questions that you just asked to say what does resolve that problem.
Yeah, that's a really compelling way to put it, and it makes me wonder who would play you and Ross in the movie that's made from this. But let's take on the broad-based opportunities. And Arkansas just announced recently that they're cutting men's and women's tennis. And Bubba, I don't know that anyone's been more outspoken over the years about the importance of broad-based athletic opportunities, Olympic sports, women's sports. You have, I think is it still 28 sports at UNC? You both know Arkansas's AD. He surely had to know that this would be front page news, that people would start to say this is going to be the demise of Olympic sports all across the country, and also could trigger a Title IX lawsuit. But putting the Title IX lawsuit aside, is this the beginning of the end? Is this the start of the snowball effect? Again, unless something significantly changes to say you have to invest X amount in your sports, because schools like Arkansas and UNC are way above the NCAA limit. So you would, if you wanted to, you could reduce sports. But are we going to see this as the beginning of a trend and say, remember back in April 2026 when Arkansas cut those tennis teams? And if Arkansas can't find a way to make it work, how can Arkansas State and everybody else?
Great question. They only went from 19 to 17. They saved $2.5 million. Those are really tough decisions, and everyone makes their own decisions. But I do think that we have to be concerned about what the future does look like. But I also think that those sports are going to continue somehow, some way. Maybe the configuration is different. So I don't think it's the end of those things, but I do think reconfiguring, refinancing, I do think we'll get to a bifurcated system. I've said this before, that will have two pay-per-play models. One is you will be paid to play your game, and others you'll have to pay if you're going to play your game. And so that's where we're going to end up, I think, at some point.
Ross, what do you think?
No, yeah, I think everybody was waiting for somebody, especially in the Big Ten or SEC, to be the first to cut a sport. And I just wonder now, now that it's happened, if there will be more of a flood of them coming this summer and maybe into the fall, that more programs eliminated. That's a suggestion and has been for a while that will happen. And I think Arkansas released that they're going to save $2.5 million annually. And you can imagine if, I think at most power conference schools that have over 25 sports, all but most power conference schools, no matter how many sports they have, make money off of just a couple sports. And the rest of them cost anywhere from $30 million to $60 million a year, probably. So you can imagine when you have all these holes in your budget and you're trying to be competitive on the recruiting trail, how easy it is to just, why don't we just eliminate this and that? And that is the fear that Arkansas's decision will, in Iowa State, I think before it, maybe a few weeks before that, also eliminated some sports. And so I think that the fear is that this will continue. And this is something that there's anything that's gotten congressional attention, it is the impact on the U.S. Olympic team based on the potential elimination of some of these sports.
Yeah, and it's interesting because oh, go ahead, Bubba.
We saw it during COVID, but it
Right.
was a different administration. So during COVID, a lot of them dropped, a lot of lawsuits, and a lot of them got put back in place, if not more. So it'll be interesting to see, because the Department of Education and Department of Justice were very different at that time.
Yeah, it's a great point. It's interesting that some are framing it as what's more valuable. I'm not saying this is the right framing, but some are framing it as is a starting wide receiver who might cost you $2.5 million over the course of whatever number of years more valuable than your men's and women's tennis programs because you could take
Yeah.
the 2.5 from the football team. And Bubby, you're shaking your head. Is that in disgust at the framing or at the reality or just my face? What do you?
It is the unfortunate framing. It's a
Yeah,
very accurate framing. It's trying to
yeah,
pick your favorite child, which is really hard to do.
yeah, yeah. All right, last couple of very quick ones. The pooling of broadcast rights. We've heard more about this over the last 6 months than maybe any other issue. Cody Campbell coming forward, others coming forward about put aside whether the SBA could actually be amended in a way that would help. But is the pooling of the rights, regardless of how it's achieved, is that the solution? Or is that, or no? I guess yes or no. Is that the solution?
I don't think it's the solution. Do I think the pooling of rights and the modification of regular season and postseason and centralizing who negotiates the rights generates more money? I think the answer to that is yes. But you can't require, at least I don't think you're going to legislatively require the pooling of rights. So I think it makes it a challenge.
And Ross,
Yeah,
clearly
I
oh yeah,
yeah.
go ahead. I was
No,
gonna
I
say
was
that
going to say
the
that.
opponents, there are some obvious opponents to the pooling of rights,
Yeah,
but go ahead.
yeah. Very big opponents, right? SEC, Big Ten, ESPN, Fox. I think none of them. A lot of those four entities have certainly been on the Hill lobbying against the pooling of rights to probably a successful degree. I think that conversation, although has gained momentum, I think everybody knows how difficult opening up the Sports Broadcasting Act would be and how much it might bog down any kind of legislation. So
I don't know that everybody
I'm not
knows
sure
that.
that's the right
There are a lot
move.
of people
But
who are
yeah,
saying silver bullet. Yeah,
many
yeah.
have maybe realized that's going to be very difficult to do. Here's the thing with my thought on the whole pooling of rights thing, I get that they will make more money. I don't think anybody's arguing that. Maybe the argument is how much more money, right? But if you give the schools more money, you better put some kind of requirement on it because the schools are just going to spend the money like they're doing now on their revenue producing sports, namely football and men's basketball. And so you're not going to help out the Olympic sport movement at all. It's just going to be more money put to the sports that generate revenue.
And that was, and again, with the NFL model. Everybody points to the pooling of the rights, which is really important. But the other piece that was even more important was the equal sharing of it. And
Mm,
that's what the NFL really needed was to maintain competitive balance and the sustainability of all their teams. So it's one thing to pool your media rights and increase the revenue, but then the question is how do you distribute it? And do you distribute it to the non-revenue sports, the Olympic sports? Because that yes, you if you increase it by $20 million or $100 million or $1 billion, whatever it is, the question is what do you do with it? If it just adds to your cost of running a football program, you haven't really accomplished much other than giving football players more money, which is fine, but that's not it's going to not fix the Olympic sport problem unless you put aside or dedicate some of the money for that and dedicate some of the money to these smaller revenue schools. All right, last question. Bubba, you have had an incredible career and you are one of the most respected, if not the most respected athletic director on this call right now, but historically. And again, I don't know many people who have a an unkind word to say about you, but beyond that, just to have glowing things to say about you and that you do things the right way and that you've been such an incredible role model for so many and are what's right about college sports and what we want to get back to in college sports. Can you, I know you're going to have lots of retrospective things and farewells and stuff, but, and I know you're not leaving yet, but can you just give your overarching thoughts on where we are, where we've been, and where you see us going? And maybe give us Because every time I talk to you, you give me a sense of comfort. So can you give us a sense of comfort about the future of college sports despite all of the difficulties it's facing now?
Sure, I'll try to, but could you call my mom and tell her those things? She's 92. She could really use some nice things. I think that the things that we talked about, I went to Washington, gosh, pre-COVID, so I was in either 19 or 20, and we talked about the values at Carolina, and I still believe they're there. I think that the four values that we talked about when we were there were education. We're providing incredible opportunities to get education through sport. We need to continue to try to maximize opportunities for kids to play. And then we also need to create more choices. And I do think this economic thing that's happening is going to create more choices for people. And then the last thing is then let's figure out the economics to make it happen. As we said, the Olympic sports are invaluable to the country, not only the Olympics themselves, but to institutions. They're drivers of enrollment in a lot of places. We do have the cliff of number 18 to 18-year-olds coming forward here in 27 and beyond. So we have to worry about that. But I do think the economics are something that we can solve. And so if you can kind of take all the other things away from it, continue to provide those great opportunities to get an education through sport. That's really what we need to do. And we will do that. It's too important. And I know I referenced too big to fail. It is too big to fail, but it's not too big to fix and to make it better. And I think we're on our path to do that. And we have Congress's attention to do it. And that's what I'd like to be involved in the next 5 or 10 years, because I think there's a lot of really good things that we do, but we've got to organize ourselves a little bit differently.
Great. Thank you, Bubba. And all the nice things I said, I said that with my Duke hat put off to the side, and I'm going to delete it before I send it to Nina. But Ross, my last question for you. Where do you put Bubba in your ranking of top athletic directors of all time?
On this call.
Yeah. Number one, of course,
Ross,
tops. Nobody beats.
What's next? What should we be looking for? You reported on a billion things. We've only been able to cover some of them. I know the potential expansion of college football playoff, but what do you see as the next big development that people should be looking for?
This arbitration case with Nebraska's pretty important, but even more important, I think, is probably May 27th, the hearing before the magistrate judge in the case that could really just topple the College Sports Commission's enforcement of NIL. And what happens if you don't really have any enforcement of the cap is the big question everybody's asking. I think, again, several things have been thrown around, uncap it or raise the cap, luxury tax. But the SEC, Big Ten, and perhaps other two power leagues, I think one of the things being contemplated, and this isn't news or anything, I wrote about it back in January a little bit when the SEC leaders came out publicly about it, is breaking away and creating their own rules and enforcement at the conference level and being able to manage a small group instead of this large group under the NCAA umbrella, and potentially avoiding some antitrust scrutiny. That is being explored for sure, and I'm sure will continue to be explored if there's not national enforcement and if the CSC fails. So that's a big deal as we go through the summer here.
Yeah, it's a great point. And there's a question of whether that bifurcation has already quietly or maybe not so quietly happened. And you quoted, I think it was Brian Fisher, that 64% of the picks in the first 4 rounds of the NFL draft played at SEC and Big Ten schools, and 91% of the players in the first 4 rounds came from a Power 4 school. So those top schools are getting the top players, but can we figure out a system where the athletes get what they deserve or what's fair, but we also maintain broader college sports as we all know and love it? And maybe those things, as Bubba, you said, they'll end up being 2 tracks where you put it really well, that some get paid to play and some are paying to play. And in some senses, we have that system. It's just the pay has been lower, but we'll see where it goes. But I can't thank you both enough. Always great to see you. Always great to talk to you. And Ross, I look forward to reading your next piece, listening to your next podcast. And Bubba, I'm excited to see what you're able to do both at UNC. I'm less excited about that success, but more excited about what you all are able to do at the national level, because I know you're so passionate about it, and we are in good hands knowing that you're still involved and will be part of the leadership moving forward. So thank you both, and I hope to talk to you both soon.
Yep, good to be on, Gabe.
Appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.